across the country. Their correspondents were also ordinary women. They were housewives, pacifists, church secretaries, many Northern white women who were compelled to participate in civil rights and engage in civil rights through benevolence because of the poverty, the Southern poverty that they had read about in their local newspapers, or because of the images of grieving widows that they saw on the cover of Life magazine. Today, I'm going to focus on the Black women of my project, those Delta mothers who were navigating the height of the movement and the local communities in its wake. In the first half of the talk, I'll be discussing Black women's use of the Box Project as a necessary food program. I'll speak to the way rural Black women use letter writing as a political act to acquire survival goods for their families, and testify to indignities they faced during and after high watermark events of the movement. This talk is called A Life After the Movement. So in the second half, I'll be speaking about the hopes and possibilities and actions of Black women after 1964, Freedom Summer, which was one of the most momentous and consequential events of the movement in Mississippi. And we'll hear from these women through my analysis of their letters to sympathizers outside of the state. We'll hear from them and hear what they have to say about life in the wake of the movement. We'll hear them discuss their attempts to actualize many of these new legislative victories in their local communities and the backlash they face. This may come across a bit choppy because I'm pulling together two different chapters from the manuscript, so bear with me in some of these transitions. The post office was a battleground for rural Black women in the Mississippi movement, and I want to also make that clear. One of the ideas that I argue in the manuscript is that Black women use the postal system and all of its capacities and possibilities to keep their children from starving and to remain informed about the movement itself and the changes within the federal welfare state. It was also a vehicle for these firsthand accounts that I'll be sharing with you today, these letters that were written by rural Black women that were folded up and sealed and sent to folks across the country. The letters written by these women make this story possible. So to begin to tell this story, we first have to understand the food landscape in Mississippi during the movement. Black women use the Box Project as a necessary, Black women use the Box Project as a necessary food program during the movement. Starvation wages of $1.25 per day for agricultural workers. These agricultural workers were slowly being replaced by mechanized cotton industry. And $12 a day, $12 a week for domestics was hardly enough to supplement the diets of large families, clothe their children for school, keep the lights on and the rent paid. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's commodities program was the federal government's half-hearted attempt to supplement the diets of poor Americans. Hardly nutritious, these packages consisted of lard, rice, butter, government cheese, government beans, flour, minced tinned meat that one woman simply referred to as dog food. In Mississippi, these packages were doled out at distribution centers that were run by local white administrators. Intimidation and physical violence at these distribution centers was common practice as leaders, local white leaders, used control over the food supply to maintain racial dominance. The food stamp program was introduced in Congress in 1961, and it became a permanent fixture in 64. In 1966, Mississippi became the first state to implement food stamps in every county. And the idea was that food stamps would replace free commodities. Food stamps in its earliest iteration, however, had to be purchased by the poor. They weren't free. And so the price, while subsidized, was never low enough to be accessible to poor families that really needed the program that the program claimed to help. Like the commodities program, food stamps had its own local racist gatekeepers who wantonly withheld food stamps or changed the cost of food stamps or food itself on a whim, particularly if there was rumor of civil rights activity in the area. And this flyer that's on the screen was made by a civil rights group talking about, the work that needs to be done in this area around getting enough food for everyone. There is enough food. But as this flyer says, the white people of Mississippi try to keep us from getting that. They're doing everything in their power to prohibit the commodities program, which was the free food program, and the food stamp program from actually doing its job. In addition to food stamps and commodities, there were food drives led by activist groups on the ground like SNCC and CORE that were generally short-term campaigns to meet the emergency needs of the poor. And they were designed to boost enthusiasm for voter registration. These were kind of quick types of campaigns to encourage folks to participate in civil rights. The supply always went quickly, and there was generally always more need than there was food to go around. And so this is the food landscape in Mississippi during the movement upon the arrival of this person-to-person box project program. News of this project spread by word of mouth from one woman, one town, one community to the next. These food boxes sent from an individual donor, attuned to a family's need directly to their doorstep, allowed rural Black women to circumvent to some degree the local white control over all access to food. We get a sense of how imperative the need for food was on the ground based on these suggestions for food boxes in the newsletter that Virginia Nave sent to donors around the country. Things like dried soup, gravy mixes, Crisco, cereal, seeds for growing gardens, powdered milk. All of these were really important items, or items that they imagine were important for folks in the Mississippi Delta. We also know how significant this program was because Black women say so in their letters. They engaged in this program to keep food on the table. Mary Taylor was a woman who opened our discussion. She had 6 children, including a son with muscular dystrophy. Her packages from a Miss Friedman in May of 1966 included many of the prescribed items on Virginia Nave's list: canned meat, dried milk, powdered potatoes. However, Mary lamented the absence of a protein and vitamin-packed powdered drink mix, instant breakfast. Added to water or milk, the nutrient-dense supplement augmented her chronically ill son's diet as he took in little more than drinkable liquids. She's holding her son, Brent, in that top picture. He's in the red shirt and overalls. Muscular dystrophy and other physical ailments bequeathed her 5-year-old son with a poor appetite, and the state's insufficient healthcare system did little to improve his quality of life. Mary allowed her son 4 servings of instant breakfast a day. Mary asked for it by name in writing to her donor, saying, if you could send me some instant breakfast, it's made by Carnation, it's the one with the baby on it, it's high in price here, and it would do me a lot of good if you could send some for him. Advocating for her son's needs, Mary used the Box Project as a crucial lifeline, essential for the survival of her family. And while doing so, she exposed the lived experience of poverty in Mississippi to those who were just discovering it. Besola Anderson, she was an Edabina mother of 12. She lives on a plantation in LaFleur County. She spoke similarly of the problems with the food stamp program and used the Box Project to feed and clothe her children for school. The first box from her helper was filled with silverware, shoes, and non-perishables. Amid the gratitude, she stated that the conditions under which they lived in Mississippi had been created by a white power structure. She said, we have some dirty folks in Mississippi, as she discussed the maddening food stamp program in her county, which required that she purchase food stamps with money borrowed from her landlord, who did not give them work or opportunities to work on the plantation. And so the moment that Anderson and her husband found work, they'd have to pay back the money that they borrowed to purchase food stamps to the landlord. But she said, so long as they lend it, I'll buy them. But how am I going to pay all that money back? Anderson knew that the new food program didn't actually work, because instead of allowing her autonomy and freedom, it kept her indebted in a racialized plantation system that offered her little to no opportunities to escape cyclical debt. Through this exchange of goods and letters, the postal system itself became a contested site for food and politics. It was critical infrastructure during the freedom struggle, as lots of information, money, and donations was passing through the postal system. And Black women used this postal system to sidestep the malevolent and arbitrary practices of local authorities who denied access to survival goods. The local postal workers started to also notice the volume of food boxes that was coming in from Connecticut, Vermont, and California and other parts of the country. The interstate channels of the project seemed to be both a kind of stealthy way for Black women to correspond with white outsiders and access food, and also an instrument by which Black women were surveilled by local white power brokers. As the postal system in Mississippi was employed by a largely white labor force, federal workers used the postal system as a weapon. They frequently withheld packages for many days or damaged box project food packages for designated for Black recipients simply because they could. The first box that Emma Jackson and her family received went to the quote boss man because they didn't have a mailbox. Fearing his questioning, Jackson suspected too that people have told him that we registered to vote. He hasn't told us to move yet, but he doesn't allow us to get the chance to get anything. He gets it even if it's pennies. Consequences also came in the form of vandalized and torn up packages. For more than a year, Dorothy Smith's packages arrived damaged and broken up with the quote, food wasted out. When Smith told her helper of these incidents, she added, I guess they just throw our boxes around because we are Negroes and they don't care anything about us. Smith asked the mailman about the tattered conditions of her boxes, and his reply was that the boxes were in that condition by the time they got to him. After asking, Dorothy decided to let it go. I'd rather not bother them again because I live around mean people. And he says that he tries to take care of them the best way he can. So I don't know. You know, we can't say too much. We might not wake up in the same place. So I would rather take it easy. Mary Taylor, she also had issues with her boxes. In 1965, she was accosted and questioned by the postmaster, a white woman, when she picked up her boxes. The postmaster asked Mary if she had, quote, any kind of people living in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Though Mary replied that she did, and the postmaster and self-imposed gatekeeper of Mississippi replied that she sent her mail back because she didn't think Mary knew anyone, even though the mail was addressed to her. In a letter about the incident, Mary told Virginia Nave that she had not been getting any mail or packages that came from out of the state for some time. Incredulously, Mary added, I've lived here 15 years or longer. I know the postmaster knows me, but people are upset here. They are so hard to get along with. Taylor associated this interaction with the postmaster with the civil rights movement. On all accounts, local Black residents like Mary Taylor, Dorothy Smith had to navigate bullheaded resistance to Black freedom and Black autonomy and Black survival in the Delta, even in the most quotidian moments, like attempting to pick up the mail. From sending communiques to allies in Vermont to confronting postal issues, letter writing itself became a political form of personal advocacy, not fully realized by many Mississippi women until they joined the Box Project. In the process of requesting survival goods and accessing food and clothing for their families through the postal system, Black women brought awareness to the negligence and malevolence of the state, which intentionally denied many Black Americans federal aid after civil rights activity increased in the state. Rural Black women's letter writing and use of the postal system was a quiet, daily act, but it wasn't passive. And they advocated for themselves in their writing. And after Freedom Summer, after many of the activists left the state, many took a more public stance toward their personal advocacy at the ballot box. And in doing so, they challenged white supremacy head on. One woman wrote, I've been picking cotton during the day and working for freedom at night. This was Alice Rogers of Winterville, Mississippi in the fall of 1965. As a young mother, she was requesting prayers that, quote, we may overcome. But at the same time, she had admitted that the movement's momentum waned a bit. She wrote, "Things have slowed up a pace after Pat Vale, who's pictured here, and all the workers have left. People have stopped coming to the meeting since they left the area." Pat Vale was a white 22-year-old co-ed from Ohio who came down to Greenville during Freedom Summer in 1964. Unlike two-thirds of the activists that summer, Vale agreed to stay on for another year to run the Greenville Freedom Greenville Freedom Project. She wanted to stay in the fall and help others register to vote at the courthouse in exchange for food and clothing. However, the fall of 1964, Vale was itching to go back home. She wanted to get back to safety. This was evident in the privacy of a letter to a friend. She said, "I was planning to be brave and stoic and spend Christmas in Greenville, but I've chickened out and I want to go back home to Ohio instead and let my mother, quote unquote, take care of me and eat some roast beef and turkey." The signs were evident in this letter. Vale would not stick around for much longer, and by the end of the summer in 1965, Vale had left the state of Mississippi for good. So women like Alice Rogers, she lamented the departure of Vale and the hundreds of other youthful activists who had passed through Mississippi from 1964 to 1965. Disenchanted, Rogers wrote these words to a distant friend: "They got us organized and moved on." The option to leave for Rogers was similar to many other Mississippi mothers. It was an impossible one or not an option at all. While outside volunteers had catalyzed the movement with Freedom Summer, and the growing disillusionment of the movement after the unsuccessful bid by the MFDP to unseat the all-white segregationist Democrats at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, at the end of that summer, it had clearly shifted the momentum and the movement was in transition. With this clarity and understanding, Rogers had a little bit of hope, but also lots of doubts and fears. She wrote in another letter, "We have this fight all by ourselves now." This gleam of hope that she did have came from the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. In theory, the law eradicated barriers to the ballot box with the stroke of a pen, but in reality, the law would take federal enforcement on many parts of the South, especially the Mississippi Delta, to be effective. Nevertheless, the law saw a spark of possibility. The law was a spark of possibility for many disfranchised people across the South. It was a federally decried turning point in the Southern status quo, and it legally permissioned many Black Southerners to take their first steps towards civil rights. Consolidated in the vote were desires regarding healthcare, good paying jobs, access to childcare, and government representation. Despite the federal government, despite efforts by the federal government to usher the South towards some degree of racial equality, many whites in the Mississippi Delta remained staunchly resistant. As late as 1966, over a year after the passage, local state officials had mostly ignored the Voting Rights Act until the federal registrars arrived. With the federal government on their side, many local people came to the polls gradually still and at great personal expense and risk. Mary Taylor, the woman who opened this paper, discussed with excitement going to register to vote with the help of friendly white accomplices shortly after the passage of the bill. Galvanized by the experience, she hoped to do more, but, quote, said she lived so far in the country and the houses are so far apart that all I know is the best thing I can do right now is to pray. If she wasn't participating by attempting to register to vote on the front lines, she was often only 1 degree removed from someone on the front lines. Mary's Aunt Sarah and her friend Alice Blackwell had both been in Jackson, Mississippi, protesting police brutality, and they kept her abreast of movement happenings. Another woman, Beauty Campbell of Holly Springs, Mississippi, desperately wanted to engage in any movement demonstrations that were to come through. She said, "We just want freedom so badly, we can almost see it. And we need a freedom school in our area to look to the other side." She wrote this in a letter to a friend. But she was still struggling to participate because there seemed to be a lack of movement infrastructure in the waning days of the movement in her community. And freedom language still, and her commitment to this idea of freedom was still woven within her language and in many of the letters she continued to send to outsiders that she was connected with. A woman, Willie May Crane in Greenwood, she found her way to the movement through a labor strike in LaFleur County. Crane was a mother of 8, and she was a somewhat unexpected, outspoken advocate of this labor strike. In the summer of 1965, field workers halted work to improve their wages. They were requesting an hourly wage of $1.25. This was an exponential pay increase from their standard $2 a day. As the work stoppage crept on, Crane encouraged those who consider going back to work to press on. I told them that anything that's not worth suffering for is not much good. When a woman told Willie May that she had returned to chopping cotton because she had bills to pay, Willie May's response was unwavering. I've had a rent sign on my house for over a month now, but my house is so raggedy, the landlord is not going to make me move. I told her I don't hardly have any food to eat, but I'm going to stay out of the field until they start paying $1.25 an hour. They don't start, I won't go. In addition to the strike, Crane took steps to actualize full citizenship. She was attempting to register to vote regularly, taking the literacy test. This was a few months before the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But she continued to go take that literacy test at the courthouse. She was determined to liberate herself, writing, I am not going to stop until I'm a registered voter. We see with Willie May Crane, after the major action of the movement, Black women were advocating for themselves in ways that fit their lives and needs. Activists came in and out of the state throughout the end of the decade, but it was up to Black mothers like Willie May Crane and Dorothy Smith to make do once the movement moved on. In the summer of 1966, while nursing a baby and chopping cotton for $2.50 a day, Dorothy Smith got word that a march was passing through her town. From the meager wages, after working so hard until, quote, I ain't got nothing and still don't have anything to eat or feed my family, to her request for basic needs for her children. Dorothy had plenty to march about. However, her mothering duties made direct action difficult. It made participating in this march really, really difficult for her. She said, when the marchers was down here marching, I sure did want to march with them, but I had my children and I wasn't able to keep up. The march that Smith and hundreds of Mississippi women watched was James Meredith's March Against Fear, which passed through small Delta towns from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi in June of 1966. Since his departure from Ole Miss 3 years earlier, James Meredith had gotten married. He had left Mississippi and moved to New York City. He was a student at Columbia University Law School. And he returned to challenge the all-pervasive and overriding fear that he believed still plagued Blacks in Mississippi. At first, it was a solo march, and it gathered little attention from national media outlets and civil rights organizations. This all changed on the second day when Meredith was shot as he crossed into Mississippi. Immediately after the shooting, Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, and other activist leaders rushed to Meredith's side, vowing to continue the march. Most SNCC and CORE activists had left Mississippi by 1966. However, the shooting brought a return of movement heavy hitters and a brief return of national attention to the state. Meredith's march was the last time the most influential civil rights groups like SNCC, CORE, SCLC, the NAACP marched under the banner of COFO and was in essence the last major march of the movement in Mississippi. The event, which sparked contention and resistance both within COFO and externally against local white supremacists, ended in Jackson, Mississippi 3 weeks after Meredith began his initial attempt. More than 10,000 Mississippians joined the march at some point along the way, sometimes hopping in until they could no longer keep up, as was the case with Dorothy Smith, while others continued until the very end. Most folks lined highways, gathered in narrow town sidewalks. They observed from their cotton fields or sitting on top of tractors, or they waved American flags from rickety porch chairs as the marchers passed on by. Once the group made it to Jackson, both Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael gave speeches on the steps of the state capitol. The speech was deemed a success, and the activists left the state. Those 10,000 folks who marched and the thousands more who watched in admiration were left to survive in the aftermath of the event. Dorothy Smith's lack of sustained participation in the march did not shield her from white reprisals from folks in her community. The following month, Dorothy wrote that, quote, "These white people down here say they ain't gonna let the marchers come back through here again." Local whites were determined to make someone, maybe it was Dorothy Smith and other local Blacks, pay for the disruption that the march caused. When she went to the local grocery store to purchase food for her family on credit, the store clerk hissed, "Why don't you go to Dr. Martin Luther King for food?" And he turned her away. Dorothy Smith was affirmed and buoyed by the experience of watching the march. She was affirmed that justice and freedom and equality were for the Black folks in her community. She simply replied to the store clerk, "Your day is coming," and she left the store. She did have to leave that store empty-handed and hungry without access to what her children needed. And I think Smith's journey home is a stark reminder of some of the ambivalent outcomes of this so-called march against fear that had passed through the state. Unlike Dorothy Smith or Mary Taylor, many well-known activists of the Mississippi movement often went home somewhere else. They went back home outside of the state. These activists are indeed characterized by their transience. To be sure and to be clear, it's many of these young people and well-known activists came to the state and energized the local people. They helped ignite local people's political consciousness and created opportunities for their engagement. But when the major campaigns were over, most of these activists moved to the next campaign. They moved on. Most local people experienced the movement, its beginning and end, its successes and failures, from a different perspective than many of these well-known activists. Smith had no choice but to encounter the store clerk, the racist store clerk, a month after the March Against Fear. Taylor, while she circumvented local food distributors who often discriminated or withheld access to the food, she was left to only encounter an intractable postal worker who sent her food boxes back north. The movement had come and gone, but these women left in its wake still had to fight. In their daily lives, these newly politicized women and participants of the movement were left wondering what to do when the marchers left and navigating that in many ways on their own. The Box Project, the project that allows me access into these stories and these experiences with all of its deficiencies, allowed Black women to access survival goods and allowed rural Black women the space to tell their own stories. When it came to food security, Black women whose dignity has been bound up in many of these interactions with the state and different welfare programs have been clear about the social safety net initiatives that work for them and those that don't. Mary Taylor, Dorothy Smith, Besola Anderson, and the many other women that you've met in this project today, their letters make clear that they have never been looking for a handout or anything like that. They are simply asking for a chance to survive and for the government to give them their fair share. Moreover, this bold act of writing their testimonies and placing them in an envelope involves substantial risks. Risks that we haven't truly acknowledged, and because many scholars have only been looking at activism from limited standpoints. Largely unacknowledged, rural Black women's letter writing was resistance through community advocacy and witnessing. Poor Black women wrote about their experiences during the movement under the threat of white supremacist violence, surveillance, and hunger. Rural Black women wanted to be heard and understood, but they weren't simply interested and invested in building relationships, with these liberal white women that they were writing. Writing was really an imperative for their survival, and it offered them more mobility than they had initially imagined in that movement. Through the Box Project, Black women's letters in and of themselves were a new dimension and a continuation of the movement long after the marchers left. Thank you all very much for listening. And I look forward to hearing any questions that you all have about the work. Thank you so much.
Can't hear the thunderous applause because everyone is muted, but go ahead if you have a question for Dr. Walker, something you're curious about, or maybe a connection that you could see, go ahead and put that in the chat, and I will be happy to ask your question on your behalf. While we're waiting for those to come in, thank you to those of you who arrived late. We're so glad you're here. We wanted to let you know too, my house is under construction. So if you hear some banging, don't worry, I'm safe. But I'm unmuted right now to talk to Dr. Walker. I took a lot of notes. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is you mentioned the buying of food stamps, which broke my heart. And what it reminded me of was kind of sharecropping 2.0. Mm-hmm. This concept, for those of you that aren't familiar with sharecropping, right? This concept of, well, you can pick yourself up by your own bootstraps after the Civil War, but we're not going to pay you anything. You're going to be in debt to your former master. And basically it's this cycle of poverty and subjugation. And here we are again, right? With like, well, we're trying to help you, but it's not our fault that you can't afford it. You just want a handout. Can you share about those connections? Like, is it just one long thread in history of the same problem, or are there different aspects to it? It just seems so unfair.
Yeah, it is really unfair. I think the thing about food stamps, I did not know that food stamps had to be paid for until I started doing this project. I was shocked to hear that. And in many ways it's connected to this idea, again, like you were speaking about, that, the government did not want to just give a handout. They wanted people to earn these resources. And so you're talking about people who were barely making anything to begin with, who had to use whatever they got from their welfare check, which was also very limited, to pay for food stamps from the government. And so it seems so cyclical, incestuous, just very strange way to kind of assist in the poorest of the poor. I don't think it became a kind of free service or kind of free system until the early 70s, when it, when folks became aware that it actually was not benefiting the people that it tended to help. And it still has, many issues, but what many of these women realize is that the money that they were making, they would rather opt out of that system, which many women in the Box Project did, and use their money to simply buy food than buy food stamps. And so, yeah, it only really accounted for these women like Bessola Anderson was talking about. She bought the food stamps, which then she was indebted now to 2 different people. And so, yeah, it created a host of other problems and cyclical debt for these people that sounds very familiar. So.
It does sound very familiar. Maybe we'll circle back on that, but it does seem like the same problem with a new name and ties to capitalism. And I'd be curious, my next question would be, and I don't know if you looked into that in the research, did the policy change too to not buy food stamps in the 70s because more whites needed to use it? It seems like the way we get out of these situations where something finally gets fixed in a hopeful way, it's never because it was just the right thing to do. So any clue on that? Or
I am actually not sure. This kind of line of thinking only came later in my project. And so I am still kind of thinking about what to do with that history, along with kind of histories of charity and benevolence in general, because that's a really big part of this the story that I'm telling. I tell the kind of the impulses and the impetus for white women and why they're choosing to participate in this way, what charity does to the individual who's giving it, how it makes them feel. And so charity and benevolence are big parts of the story too. But yeah, I haven't thought far enough about what happens with that switch.
I think it's just, and I'm not trying to stump you by any means. It's just, the more I talk to people in the community or to students who often think that history is like old dead people, right? Like the photographs you're showing, those people are like 55 years old. Like
Mhm.
they're not that old, right? They're still walking around, and yet their mothers were the ones writing this letters. And what kind of, thinking of the 1619 project, what remnants do we still have with us? It's not left in the past. So
Mhm.
thank you for drawing those connections for us. And I love that you framed it, the story I'm telling.
Mhm.
I wanted to kind of mention, Sochi had a great comment when you were sharing about buying the food stamp. She says it feels more like punishment for being poor, which I think is a very accurate description.
Mhm.
And then somebody asked, Eamon, hi Eamon, he asked, what was another job other than field work that African-American women were doing? And maybe is that delineated based on like being urban and being rural?
Well, so labor is like in flux during this time because many folks are being replaced by machines. So the mechanized cotton industry is taking place. I mean, it starts as early as the 1930s. And so even that was often used as a way to punish Black folks for participating in civil rights. Many plantations hadn't choose to kind of pick up some of the mechanized uh, tools. But once they saw that, and there's a really great book about this called You Can't Eat Freedom by Greta DeJong. And she talks about how folks were essentially being hungried out of the state. So you keep them from working on the plantations because the mechanized cotton industry essentially replaces the need for the labor of the majority of African Americans. You don't really provide any type of other types of opportunities for them. You you limit their access to food and welfare and all of these things. And so we often talk about the early Great Migration between 1917 and 1945, but there's also a second Great Migration that's happening where many African Americans from the 60s through the 80s are leaving the South because there aren't any jobs or opportunities. And so, and what's happening too in the Delta is that folks are being pushed out because the cotton industry is being mechanized. There was other types of work. Some women were working as domestics. Working, finding jobs here and there when they could, cleaning up houses and things like that. But the primary form of industry for Black women and men during this time, they were slowly being pushed out of this work, was agricultural labor.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I think a lot of connections too, right? Back to capitalism, back to the intersectional idea that these aren't just, it's not just about women's issues. Like, I love that you have 2 degrees, right? I think that's a great example of they're not apart from each other, like women's history and history in and of itself, right? And, we have another category of economic history, right? And political science and legal history. And these things are all like converging on one particular people group in one particular place in time. Rebecca asked, and Rebecca, it's not a random question, it's a great question. How did you find out about the Box Project? So can you tell us a little bit about where you researched it, how you found out about it, and your grad school experience all rolled into one? Oh, you need to unmute, Dr. Walker. She's like, hold on, I need to take some notes. It's a long story.
So I actually found out about the Box Project through my family. So my grandmother was a Box Project recipient in the Mississippi Delta, actually on both sides. But I found out about it with conversations with my maternal grandmother, right before I started my master's program, I did not have a project. And I was like talking to her, and she was showing me this apron. And I said, "Where did you get that apron, Grandma? It's so cute." And she was like, "Oh, my box lady sent me the fabric." So she had been writing her box lady, which is what she called her, for like 30 or 40 years, living in Connecticut. Her box lady's name was Anne. And they had a long correspondence, and I was like, this is really fascinating. I had never heard about this before. And kind of along with that, I was also thinking about like what were women who were mothers doing during the civil rights movement? What were women who were like my grandmothers, raising 8 children, 12 children, doing during the civil rights movement? I had had some conversations here and there with them about, when was the first time they had voted? They lived in Sunflower County, um, near where Fannie Lou Hamer was from. They had lived in these places that we have heard about, that we have read all these books about. But I hadn't heard anything, or read anything that really gave me an account for them. And so I found the box project. I started doing research, found that a collection had just been donated with all of these letters that I'm using. I also did some interviews with women who were participants, Black women in the Delta, and some white women participants. I found the founder who she had passed away right when I got research money to go interview her. But in some ways, I think it turned out okay, because I was able to go to her memorial, interview her children, hear how people remembered her, and get kind of a sense of all of these other social movements that she was connected to. She was a really big pacifist. Her husband was a conscientious objector. She was an artist. She, lived in kind of bohemian villages in New York, then went to live in the land in Vermont, like really interesting history. And so I was able to I've been still putting these stories together that give me a sense of, one, how ordinary women understood the movement, and then what compelled them in many ways to act. I get a sense of how ordinary Black women were surviving through the movement, what actually, got them out of their front doors to go register to vote, how care for their children was the primary goal, how access for food was the primary goal for them, and how proud they were to go vote, but they needed shoes on their feet first, and they needed shoes on their kids' feet first, and how they cooperated with many of the activists, but their stories just simply hadn't been told. And there are a lot of other books that talk about how these activists, are going down to Mississippi, and they're going to lift these folks and liberate them. And I love the book Coming of Age in Mississippi by Ann Moody, but she talks about Delta people like they just don't know anything. And so it was really important for me to hear it from their own mouths and from their own perspectives about what their daily lives were like, what their experiences were like, engaging, cooperating. And I realized that the movement for them was also about, getting the right to vote, but about food and about healthcare and about all of these other things. So yeah, it was through a personal connection. And I'll just say really quickly, I started out, I had always loved history. I was a high school teacher for 2 years right after undergrad. And then I just couldn't get away from like that research desire. So I did a master's program at the University of New Orleans. And I really loved doing it. Wasn't sure if I should get a doctorate. One of my professors really encouraged me that my project was something worth pursuing. And so she encouraged me to apply to doctoral programs. I was terrified to do so, but she encouraged me to apply to the best programs where where my project would be mentored and nourished by, folks who do Black women's history and who study the welfare state. And so I'm really grateful to, my MA professors who really, told me there was promise in the work that I was doing, because otherwise I wasn't so sure in myself. But I got to Rutgers, and really loved it. Grad school was some of the best years of my life, and I made really, really wonderful friends. Um, and you really just get to be super curious and read a lot of books and kind of think about the world in different ways. And so I really enjoyed grad school. I was telling Professor Stonis how great it was before we got on the call. But if anyone's thinking about it, do your research and yeah, pursue it.
Well, that's a great, if my house is falling down, that's a great word of encouragement too. If sometimes we don't see the potential we have, or we feel like we have imposter syndrome, or maybe a teacher even said something negative to us at one point. And so the fact that you found the resilience inside yourself to believe in your work, right? Like, you're very lucky you found a box of newly donated, right? Have not been thoroughly researched. Like, it kind of, the universe just kind of plopped it in your lap. Like, here you are, this is for you. That's amazing. A couple of questions center around, for example, Prenny asked, what gave the Black female activists the passion and determination to fight for their rights? And what kept them continuing to fight even after not being able to feed their children?
Yeah. Well, I think it's that the personal political elements, right? That we know, like, it was about their children. It was, and I also think that, there's one woman's letters that I have almost a decade of her writing, and she kind of slowly starts to unfold as I'm like, reading. She knows some things about civil rights. She knows that the way that they're treated is unfairly. But I think even having conversations with friendly outsiders for the women in my project really encourages them and affirms that what they're fighting for is right and just. Many of these women had not interacted with a single kind white person in their lives, and they say this in their letters, that we just, the white people down here are not nice and they are not kind. And one woman was like, I didn't even know you were white, I thought you were a Black person because you were so friendly to us. And so I think they realized that this lie, and they knew, many of these women knew, but I think they understood that there were supporters beyond that space, um, and that they had people in their corner, and that they weren't necessarily kind of in this on their own. And having these conversations and written conversations with people often gave them the language to confront many of the folks that they were facing at the post office or the postal system, or excuse me, at the grocery store. Many of these women were also being sent pamphlets about the Voting Rights Act, stuff that they couldn't access on the local level. They were being sent information about the National Welfare Rights Organization, because they were also being discriminated in all these other elements of their lives. And so they were getting kind of legitimate information about all of these resources, that then they were allowed to kind of use that experience, use that information on the local level to go advocate for themselves at the welfare office, to go say that I know this legislation was passed and I don't have to take this literacy test anymore. Like, I know that we can vote. And they were communicating with their neighbors, because in many of these communities, these towns were so small. We're talking one town, I think Sunflower County had about 600 people in it. Another town had about, 200 people. Many of these towns had up to, like, lots of women were box project recipients in some of these really small towns. So these women were having communications with each other too, and they were talking to folks on the outside. And I think they were encouraged by the women that they were communicating with on the outside, and also in the conversations that they were having and being encouraged by one another, that they, we'll go together and go register. We'll try to go to that meeting and see about putting a Head Start in our town. And so they were doing all of this work and communication, not just amongst themselves, but had a kind of a lifeline to the outside too, to know that what they were fighting for was just, and that they had support outside.
It sounds like the consciousness raising of the feminist movement, right? Getting that confirmation from someone else of like, oh, you too? Oh, me too.
Mhm.
Okay, what are we
Yeah.
going to do about it? Michaela asked a great question. She said on one of the slides that it basically said along the lines, if you were not considered poor, then the government, you didn't even have the chance to buy the stamp. So what was considered poor?
So there are these, and I don't remember the exact, the kind of line by line, kind of how they did it, but they had these scales that would say, if you were a family of, if you were a family of, 10 people and you made $0 or between $1 and $10, you still have to pay something for the foods. You still have to pay something for the food stamps. So they had like a system to determine based on your income, whatever that amount could be. And it again changes from month to month depending on the availability of work. And so if you're able to get work on the plantation that month, maybe you'll be able to pay for a little bit of food stamps, but you might, in the spring months or at different times of the year, you might not have work that whole month. And so there was this kind of spreadsheet that they created. I think it was the USDA created to determine how much someone should be allocated for food stamps. And I mean, it ranged. And then there were some folks who might have made a little bit more money, so they might have to pay $18 for food stamps. But think about that in relation to paying their rent, which they still had to do. $17, $20 for food stamps, even though they might have been getting, if you're paying $20 for food stamps, you might get $60 worth of groceries. And so even that still was a lot for folks who made $2 a day when they could find work. So the government had a system to determine if you were poor enough to get these. Yeah, I wish I had known that was a question. I would have showed it because it's a really interesting nonsense chart that they use to determine it.
Well, and I think apart from the numbers, historians, we're not always math people anyway, but you're kind of pointing to this idea of as a moving target, and it almost didn't encourage people to participate if it's always, it made it more difficult than it needed to be. Reminds me of some current system now about helping people, right? Of like, well, here's the carrot, but you make it so hard, or you have to get childcare to do it, then it's really not help. And actually, Ani asks, what comparisons would you draw to the social welfare system today? Has much changed, if anything? And I know that might be outside the scope, so please feel free to reinterpret as you.
I'm actually trying to pull up a slide that I have from another talk where I kind of connected the Box Project to other.
Or you can show it next time, because we already know we need to have you back. So you already know I'm going to be up in your email asking you on these liberal, wealthy white women. So just put it in that.
Well, so, I mean, I think, there are lots of problems, with the welfare state. And I think it's interesting that this, the Box Project was a private benevolence program, right? That was meant to meet the needs of poor Black families, and at the same time, make Northern women feel good about their contributions to the movement. And I was doing this research and was surprised to also find that like the era of food boxes is not over. There have actually been a number of food box projects that have appeared within the last 2 years that have attempted to do similar things. Cutting food stamps, cutting access to resources that allow poor families choice in what they eat, and sending these families a box of food that had been selected by the federal government. This was one program called a Harvest Box that was created a couple years ago by the Trump administration. And I found a number of articles about how these things were often given to the poorest, often sent to reservations, expired food, not just canned goods, government meat, stuff that, you know, my grandmother received in her commodities box was still being kind of sent and delivered as a way to supplement the diets of poor Americans. And they were not successful. And we know, and they actually cost more money. They cost money to ship, more money to ship than simply giving people money and allowing them choice and giving them cash to spend at grocery stores, allowing them choice to kind of determine what they want to take into their own bodies. And so we've seen a number of just issues with and contemporary attempts to replace food stamps with these food boxes that do little to actually end hunger. And yeah, that's just one surprising example that I found in the course of my research too, about thinking about, like, you know, how do we solve hunger? Person to person donations, these benevolent projects and private charities, those are emergency food projects. They are not sustaining and sustainable projects. And similarly, this food box program might serve emergency food need, but they don't kind of help build sustaining communities, sustainable communities, and solve hunger problems. And I think, yeah, we still haven't quite worked and figured out how to actually solve hunger for the people who need it most.
Yeah, I think that connects to something that our librarian, Becca Cooling, mentioned. Hi, Becca, thank you for being here. And she was kind of talking about the idea of NIMBY, like not in my backyard. And, you know, this idea that you spoke about of, you know, the feeling that these Black women, these Black mothers had of, like, now I can't buy food at the grocery stores because of what these people did, who just came in, organized us, right, had a march and left, right? Like these folks that end up feeling abandoned when white liberal activists leave. Can you speak to that at all, of what that was like, or is that the way to do it? I mean,
I think there are probably better equipped contemporary activists who could speak to the ways to make kind of lasting change. But I will say that, like, many of kind of Ella Baker's ideologies around this were around organizing the local people so they can be their own leaders and so that they can be within their own communities. And we see one example of this is in Fannie Lou Hamer, who is already a leader in her community. She's already someone who has influence. And she, after being trained with some of the SNCC activists, builds Freedom Farm Co-op. She has hopes for self-sustaining Mississippi Delta communities. And so she is one example of what we see when SNCC does come down and start organizing local people and recognizing those indigenous leaders, who has a really powerful and impactful influence in her local community. But yeah, as far as kind of organizing structure, I think that is an ongoing issue. And I think, you know, there's like a tension between, you know, one thing that's taken place in my project is, like, one thing that I think makes it easy for Northern white women to participate is because they don't have to engage with poverty projects in their own communities, that they can send a box of food to a poor family in Mississippi and check that off their box, and they have done their good deed. And so I think in many ways, you know, like on the opposite level, there are folks who go down and put their lives on the line, and that is all really noble. So these things are really kind of held in tension, right? That especially when it came to the white women participants who were interested, I think many of the white women of a certain age who were mothers thought simply, we can't do that. I'm a mother. I live in New England. And they used to hold up quite often Viola Liuzzo. I don't know if anyone knows her story. She was a white Detroit mother who goes down to Selma after witnessing Bloody Sunday. She was working class woman, was kind of going back to school. She had 5 children. After witnessing Bloody Sunday, she tells her husband, I'm going down and I'm marching. And she was murdered by the Klan. She was one of the only white women who was murdered during the civil rights movement, participating in civil rights. And she was featured in other articles that were well read by white women. And they were like, should she have done this? She abandoned her children. She should not have participated. Racial justice work is not her cause. And she should have stayed where she was. And I think for many white women, that was kind of a caution to them to stay put and figure out another way to participate, whether that be through benevolence, whether that be through donating to SNCC and all of these other organizations, but do not go south.
That's interesting. I'm nerding out so much because that's really interesting with this story about Viola, because it reminds me of captivity narratives of like kind of the broad issued shot in the dark warning of like, don't be like her. Don't be a bad mother. There's ways for you to help, right? Kind of as Becca was mentioning, like it doesn't have to be in your backyard. You also mentioned benevolence, which I find really interesting with the crossovers of how missionary work was done in the 19th century, right? Here you have white women that are paying for boxes to help the less fortunate, and they go and visit and then they leave, but with all these ramifications left behind, right? That idea, it's a big question we're still grappling with of like, how do we do benevolence well in a way that doesn't harm people even worse? Right? How do we equip the people closest to the problem to solve it? Both because they know the solutions they need, but also we might have something that they need: money, time, capital, organization, training on how to speak. How do we do that in a way that like affirms the dignity of the people already there? And I think that's so fascinating. And we've gotten it wrong so many times in history. But every time we keep learning these stories, we get closer to, okay, well, this worked, that didn't, this is what we can learn. Can you expand upon how women, maybe as a group, were treated and regarded in the civil rights movement? Right? You mentioned a lot of male leaders, and those are probably the ones that many of us who logged in today are familiar with. Like everybody knows Martin Luther King Jr., but maybe some of these women's names are newer. So can you explain what the role of women was in the movement, particularly Black women, how they were regarded?
I see. I'm laughing because I see a couple of my students, and we have talked about this exhaustively.
Let's unmute one of them and just on the spot. Let's go.
No, I'm not going to do that to them.
I'm just kidding.
But I think, we talked a lot about Ella Baker, who I just brought up, who is kind of this intellectual genius when it came to kind of thinking about how students she really focused on working with students in the latter kind of part of her activist career. But she was a really important person who was frustrated with working with the men of the movement, and the NAACP and SCLC felt like they weren't being progressive enough or being sidelined or too concerned with respectability. And so when, she sees these young student activists initiating these direct engagement with these sit-ins, she's like, we need to harness their power, and before they're untainted by the older, more respectable organizations, and create with money from the SCLC has a conference so that these students can come together and create their own ideologies and their own organizations and intellectual philosophy, I should say, around what their movement is going to be. So we see women being mentors to student activists, We see women being the organizers. My students who have read about the Montgomery bus boycott, that they were the foot soldiers, and the kind of backbone of a lot of that organizing work that took place in Montgomery. And we see them, within the student movement, really overrepresented too in some of the canvassing work that was taking place in Mississippi. And so women were incredibly influential. We don't often see them, or they're not as visible. And a lot of that, in this article that I was reading, has to do with photography too. A lot of women are not, there's this really great article about, I feel like I'm going off topic, but it's an article about, there's an article by, I think her name is Tanisha Ford, about SNCC women wearing denim rather than their Sunday's best when they start participating in a lot of the activism in Mississippi. And it has a lot to do with kind of taking on a kind of working class sensibility and the working class garb that they're engaging with a lot of local sharecroppers. And many of these women are wearing denim. They're wearing their jean overalls just as much as the men, but they're not photographed as much in that denim attire. And often they're not photographed simply as much in general. And so we see part of that overrepresentation of men has to do with the way that the movement was captured in photography too.
That's fascinating, right? Because it's about the records that are left behind, right? Someone asked earlier about primary and secondary sources. And I really appreciated that you let us see the letters in the women's own handwriting, right? That if, thinking about, we are primary sources for living through a pandemic. If we don't leave sources about what it's like to be us with all of our different identities in our location, this period of time, then historians 100 years from now will have a hard time representing what our reality was. So that's really fascinating that the photography ends up creating, right, this different historical memory or narrative. I put the link to her the article she mentioned in the chat, which is available through JSTOR. And there's another link I'll share in a moment. Christina had a great question. She said that, she understands that this came from your family's initial experience with the Box Project. How did they feel, or particularly your grandma, when they found out this is what you were going to study?
She was, pretty proud. I have not necessarily, I've attempted to interview my grandmother. She's since passed away, but before that, I have tried interviewing her. It is difficult because I'm her granddaughter. She won't sit down. She wouldn't sit down and have a real conversation. She was always up moving around her kitchen. And so she is, I have her in acknowledgments, but she would not sit down to be a primary source. And so I'm very lucky that I was able to locate other women who would chat with me. I also found my father's aunt's letters in the archive. And so I was able to tell the story of some members of my family that way by finding their primary source. She's the woman, and very spicy, was like, we have dirty folks in Mississippi, and let me tell you about them. And it sounds just like who I remember her to be. So I was able to find her work in the archives. But I think they're proud. I think they won't quite understand what it is I'm doing until they see a book. But they always, every time I'm doing research, and I'm there, in the Delta for 3 or 4 weeks, Pam's down here working on her projects, and so they know, and they're excited about it. But I think I got to get them the book soon.
Yeah, it makes it sound like you're working on a craft. Like, oh, she's in town.
She's in town. She's, and it's funny because I guess about 4 summers ago, the way that I found the women I interviewed, and this is maybe some way that I'm using kind of my personal experiences to my advantage. My grandmother read the newspaper still, every day. These little towns in the Delta, they are still, reading the newspaper and using the want ads. So I had gotten some grant money to do interviews with women in the Delta. And I was like, how am I going to find these ladies? I don't know where they are. It's like, well, maybe I'll put ads in the paper. Like, my grandma still reads the paper. Surely somebody's still reading the paper. And I put ads in 4 different papers and got a solid like 20 responses from women who saw the ad, knew about the box project or had heard about it, or were children during the box project, and spoke with them. And so, I mean, that's one way that kind of my personal connection and awareness of the community and the town has really benefited and helped me with my research. Even if my grandmother wouldn't sit down for an interview, some of her characteristics and qualities allowed me to kind of think like women in her community and in her area to do some interviews.
That's amazing, first of all, that you had the foresight to think about, how do I reach these people, right? It's not a one size fits all. And I think that's a current conversation we're having, right, in academia about who gets to study what, right? And in the same way that we want to empower people closest to a problem to fix it, we also need to realize that there's intrinsic wisdom in some families and communities that gives them an insight on questions to ask or ways to work with a community that it's not just anyone could pick it up. So thank you for doing that work. That's amazing. Sounds like a spicy grandma too. She's like, no, I'm not talking. You mentioned something too about your aunt being spicy in the letters, right? And I think that's interesting for students to remember too. That's why we want a multiplicity of sources, right? Because one person writing, they weren't so nice, is somebody else is like, they're dirty, is somebody else is like, they're full racist, right?
Yeah.
And so having different letters, that was so amazing that you were able to interview so many people. In the chat, Angelo asked, was this hunger problem only in Mississippi? Like, did the box project ever spread outside of the state?
So its focus was primarily Mississippi, even though hunger was definitely an issue in other parts of the country in general. But I think because of the attention that the civil rights movement was getting, women in this project really, and the women who founded the project were really attentive to the South. I think one thing that brought hunger to this national stage was the event that took place when Robert Kennedy went to rural Mississippi in 1967 to investigate and look into the hunger issues. There was a hearing in 1967 in Jackson. And in addition to that, they went into the Mississippi Delta. A photographer came with them, and they took pictures of people in these communities. And they were headlines in newspapers and different photograph books. And that really brought the attention to a lot of these women who were living in Connecticut, New York, other parts of the country, and kind of drew their attention to the hunger issue and the discovery of hunger in Mississippi, but also in Alabama and other parts of the South. And so the project, while primarily about Mississippi, it also had some kind of outlets that were sent to other places, but Mississippi was the focal point, particularly because of this Kennedy trip and because of the civil rights activism and the ideas that women outside of the state had about Mississippi as being the kind of the worst of the worst when it came to civil rights.
That's really interesting that you kind of mentioned how Mississippi, right, in historical memory and how it was framed. And I wanted to ask you, we have about 5 minutes left, so if anyone else has questions, please do send them in now. But I wanted to go back, Dr. Walker, to one of your first slides where it was a Black woman, maybe she was picking something and there was some text. Could you show us that one again?
Sure.
Ask a question, but I want it to be fresh in everyone's mind. when I saw that image and I read the text, it really reminded me of the racist caricatures from the Freedmen's Bureau era. That really, you know, the Freedmen's Bureau, for those of you who don't know, was right after the Civil War. It was a poorly funded social welfare organization that was supposed to bring equality and equity to newly freed Black Americans. However, it was poorly funded, only had 1,000 agents. They never did give out land as they were supposed to. It's where we get the 40 acres and a mule. But the posters that people made that were anti the policy always had an element of white supremacy racism. It wasn't just about the policy, right, which we could debate about, it was about the people it was helping. Can you be blunt and very straightforward, not that you need permission, of the ties between people who were anti-food box project, anti-federal help, and the tie to racism, the tie to this idea that Blacks were somehow misusing the funds, didn't really need it?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad you drew that thread to the Reconstruction era, up to the present, or up to the 1960s, because what we see during the Civil Rights Movement, after the Civil Rights Movement, there is an initiative called the War on Poverty that sends money directly to communities in places like Mississippi and urban poor communities. These initially, many of the War on Poverty projects had these mandates. The mandate is escaping me, but it was like maximum, I think it was maximum feasible participation of poor people. Up to 90% of the people in these War on Poverty, these kind of local War on Poverty projects, had to be people from the community, had to be poor people, and they had to run the projects themselves. These people were getting money directly from the federal government, hundreds, sometimes millions of dollars, to run their own projects. And many of them, a great majority of them, were really effective. They were running Head Start programs, community hospitals. This was all too successful for people in the Mississippi Delta because many white power brokers were incredibly frustrated that the money wasn't vetted by them. So then there were all of these rumors that, oh, they're mishandling the money. There's mismanagement. They're not spending that money properly. So a lot of these programs were defunded based off the rumor and the lie that there was mismanagement in many of these economic programs that gave money directly to the poor. And that's why we see, much of these War on Poverty initiatives are short-lived. Crystal Sanders has a really great book. I've been, given the book references today, but this one's called A Chance for Change, and it's about the Head Start program. And it talks about how successful many of these Head Start programs were in Mississippi, and how because they were so successful, it's like the success kind of brings about the demise because the senators in the state and other kind of white council members were disappointed that they didn't have to vet them. And so they start these rumors and these lies about money mismanagement and financial mismanagement. And so we see a kind of cyclical thing happening when folks are able to kind of chart their own course and their own destiny when it comes to finally having access and the resources to build their own programs. What happens because they're so successful.
Well, thank you for ending on that note, right? And kind of helping us to think about why there was pushback. What does that mean for today? How can we look at sources like this and think about things that we see right now in the real world of like, what is still embedded with this very racist legacy or the kind of disparaging of people instead of policy? Thank you for that. I would love to invite you back. So we will be chatting. I know in the comments, people are thanking you for a great event and that they learned so much. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all of our attendees, especially Dr. Walker's students. Thank you for your engagement, participation. This is our last event for the semester, and we will be back in the spring with the first lecture in March. Please watch our Instagram page, GCC History Department, for more information. And hopefully we will see Dr. Walker on the lineup for next semester as well. Thank you so much. And the link is in the chat if you would like to watch this recording in the next week. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.